Welcome to NewYorkBIOs Virtual Breakfast Series, a digital program started in 2020 bringing you fireside chats with leaders across the healthcare spectrum. This week's episode features Alan Tamarelli, partner at Cooley.
Everyone. Good morning. My name is Jennifer Hawksbland, and I'm the CEO at New York Bio. We are excited that you're joining us for another edition of our virtual breakfast series. This morning, we have Alan Tamarelli from our partners at Cooley joining us. So thanks, Alan, for being here. I've known Alan for a long time now. We won't say how long because the joke is that gives that gives my age away, and we are not. I am now of the age where we don't do that. So, Alan and I worked together at Merck, and he has been an amazing partner from the legal side of things, right, to the pharmaceutical business, to government affairs and policy when that's where I was. But today we're going to get to talk a lot about his transactions practice and his advising of early companies. So we've got a whole bunch to dig into. I know that you will have questions, so please put those in the chat or the Q&A as we go through the conversation this morning. And with that, I'll kick it over to Derek to start us off.
All right. Well, Alan, thank you so much for being here. For those of you that didn't go, you guys held a great event a couple weeks ago in your new space. We missed the orange sky by a day or so. That had to be kind of surreal. But you guys have a great new headquarters, and it put on a terrific event. So thanks so much for that. It's great to have you here because I think the role of lawyers and legal counsel as advisors, I think, has shifted over recent years, and I think it's going to be really fun to talk about that. But before we get into it, why don't you tell us a little bit about your background, even though Jennifer stepped on the story a little bit by breaking the Merck news, but why don't you tell us a little bit about how you got where you are today?
Yeah, sure. So I'm a partner in our life sciences partnering practice group, and I can talk a little bit about how I got here and sort of what I do. I started out as just sort of a general corporate attorney, many years ago before I was at Merck, working with companies in a variety of industries and a lot of different types of transactions. And at that early point in my career, I really started to get interested in finding an industry that I would be really excited about and really get to learn deeply. I found it a little bit frustrating to work across industries and with different companies and not really understand their businesses super well. So I gave it a lot of thought, and I decided, I was very interested in the life sciences space and the pharma space, in particular the biotech space. So I went in-house at Merck, where I was with Jennifer for about 10 or 11 years, working on really in a variety of roles there. And really had a nice experience being exposed to a lot of different parts of the industry, a lot of different important facets of the pharma or the biotech industry. I eventually got anxious to get back out into private practice, in part because I saw so many amazing, exciting technologies that were real breakthroughs happening today in life sciences. And I thought it would be fun to get out and work with some of the smaller innovative companies that were working in those spaces and in a wider variety of those. So I went back out into private practice at a different large law firm, not Cooley, was a partner there for a while doing transactions work, and have come over a few years ago now to Cooley doing transactions work in what we call the life sciences partnering practice, which is a practice that's 100% focused on life science companies, biotech, pharma, medical device, some things that don't fit squarely in any of those boxes, some AI and other things, some med tech, et cetera. And the practice that I work on, really, the best way to describe it is it involves sort of all of the transactions that the business development folks at companies work on. So, in-license agreements, out-license agreements, collaboration agreements, joint ventures, R&D, transactions, tech transfer, supply agreements, all the things that are really sort of hardcore life sciences. And then I do a little bit of M&A and financing work as well. And it's been exciting because I have gotten to work with a lot of sort of early stage companies that are sort of taking technology out of universities, finding seed investors or venture investors, sort of see them through the whole life cycle up through, maybe an IPO when the markets allow that, or maybe an M&A exit or something exciting like that. So it's been fun.
It's also a lifestyle.
It's a lifestyle. Yeah, it's a lifestyle. but it also, it's fun. We get to do a lot of things like the event we had the other day with you guys, to sort of, meet and network within the ecosystem, because the place that I practice in, the partnering space, is really fun because there are just so many stakeholders in that space that have to work together well, and getting to work with all of them it is fun. So those kind of networking events are particularly appealing to me.
So we've got, I think, a good way to break this up is let's kind of talk about different stages of companies as we go. And if we kind of wind back all the way to the embryonic stage, the first thing a company with the technology that has to do is get it out of academia, so to speak. Most of them, many of them come from academia. So let's just pretend that they all do. So what are some of the things to think about when you're a small company, there's technology you have to get out of academia? How do you approach the licensing discussion? What are some of the considerations? What are some of the things people don't think about? I think they're always challenging, but what are some of the things that would kind of make people's lives easier if they thought about them this way first?
Yeah, I think so. First, the number one thing is identify a really exciting technology that has that's going to have some usefulness. But once you get past that and you have something you really want to build a company around, I think the important thing is to not focus on a licensing negotiation with a university or another research institute. Just thinking about today and sort of what terms you would like today, but really think about it from the perspective of all the different stakeholders that are going to come along later, because what you really need is a license that's a win-win for a lot of different stakeholders. So it has to be a win for the university. You have to be respectful of that. You have to make sure that the university is getting a good deal. It has to be a good deal for the founders. And so these are usually the founders doing that negotiation or participating in that negotiation at that stage. But they need something that's going to attract investors. They need terms that seed investors, venture investors are going to like. But then they also have to be thinking really long term, like what is a big pharma or a big biotech partner going to want someday when they come in and they want to sublicense that technology or they want to acquire the company. And so sort of that long view of what's a license that really, not just something that looks nice today or throw it down on a piece of paper quickly, but sort of what is something that will survive through the life of a company, and it's still going to be an attractive license and a useful and a protective license when you're at that IPO stage many years later, or when somebody's coming in to look at you and due diligence to acquire you.
Are there any?
I was gonna say, when you think about it, like you're basically asking someone who has no expertise in an area to think about literally the entire life cycle of the IP and what that could do. So I assume that that's where a trusted legal advisor would come in to help with the process.
Yeah, that is one thing that's really important, is sort of understanding what's market or what's not, and sort of making sure that you get terms that people are used to seeing, investors are used to seeing, and that they look normal, they look the way they usually do, they're not onerous. But also, I think you have to be making a proposal that's fair to the licensor, to the university, and so you have to really take into account the fact that the financial and other terms have to work for them. But yeah, knowing what's market is super important, and then also just looking for unusual provisions that you sort of just, if you've been through this a number of times, they're going to throw up a red flag someday in diligence, or be sort of a roadblock to somebody within that group of people who care about that license someday.
What are some of those? That was my next question.
Yeah. So some of those would be, if there are, exit payments or some kind of, payment like that a university wants to get that are like extremely high and they're just not market, that's not going to be appealing at all. Undue restrictions on sublicensing. I mean, the name of the game for a lot of companies is to be able to sublicense and to do it on market terms. And so sometimes you see, requests on the licensor side for a bunch of onerous provisions, and you want to sort of try to talk those down and get those market and sort of usable. And then it's really important too, some of the discussions around territory splits or indication splits or fields of use are really important, because you have to sort of think about how an ultimate pharma partner who wants to commercialize this product, what are they going to want? They're going to want certain territories. They're going to want to have to own a certain space, and sort of thinking through those, not just kind of what can the new company quickly get for itself, but sort of what is a bigger player going to want.
Yep.
And so when you talk about territory, you mean like EMA or Asia or like that, or are you talking about other types?
Yeah, for territory, geographic territory. I mean, ideally, every licensee would probably like to get worldwide rights, but then how does that work? And do you really have to pursue diligence in all the territories? If you don't, what happens? Making sure you hang on to those rights and you don't just lose them quickly if you're not pursuing them right away. Because of course, no small company is going to pursue every development in every country initially. So sort of having a set of diligence milestones that are reasonable and realistic. That's another big point to focus on.
I think you guys were one of the folks that worked on, Orrin Herskowitz over the pandemic put together a group of investors and lawyers and whatever, and a whole bunch of folks to kind of work on a quote unquote standard term sheet for university spinouts, which I think was a really big idea. It's great to have that out there and have a little bit of consensus around the community. But it's funny, I remember him telling me, he goes, the only reason this happened is because we could use Zoom and everyone was available. So he goes, I got meetings with all these people that I could never possibly get if we had to do it in person. But talk a little bit about that. It was great to see that come about. I think it's a really good thing for the industry.
Yeah, it was a tremendous undertaking, and hopefully it gets legs in the sense that even more institutions sign up or get on board or say they will work from that forum. And hopefully, many more investors, venture funds will say they like that forum as well, because I think it really, the beautiful thing is it kind of jumps you a third of the way or half the way through the negotiation. I mean,
yeah.
It cuts out a lot of the really outrageous initial positions that one side or the other might take that just are not market at all. And of course, the form, and Derek, sounds like you've seen it, it leaves a lot of room for negotiating, but within sort of reasonable bounds, right? Like this is sort of how an agreement normally looks. And here's sort of, the guardrails. And so I think it's a really useful tool. And I think it will be a great thing for the industry in general if it gets a lot of traction, if a lot of folks start to use it, because it'll just cut down on the negotiation time of these initial licenses quite a bit.
I think from the standpoint of an entrepreneur, especially one who may or may not be very well versed in this, it's always great to know what it's not always is great, but it's always helpful to know what kind of the industry average is, right? Because these terms can look like they're onerous, right? But you have to understand what kind of things that really, everyone has to deal with versus, these guys are just picking on me, which is kind of, a normal way for someone to feel when they haven't gone through this, and it gets to be kind of a difficult process.
Yeah, well, that's a great tool. That form or that form agreement is a tremendous tool also, I think, for founders or for people that aren't that familiar. Jennifer, to your point earlier, like if you don't know that much about this, you haven't been through it before, it's a really nice thing that somebody really smart, and so most of the founders of these companies are really smart. They can sit down with this in advance, read it. It has a bunch of annotated footnotes and things like that help sort of, give somebody a pretty good sense, and then they can go into the negotiation, and they're negotiating again within a range of sort of norm, which is what we all want to do.
All right. Well, I'm at a bit of a crossroads. I'm almost a little bit disappointed. David Kalo usually would have chimed in with a question about IP by now, so I'm going to have to ask it. We can actually move a little bit to, IP is the other kind of piece that you need to add early, and one of the challenging things is that's usually a different set of lawyers or a different negotiation or a completely different diligence set, right? So can you talk a little bit about kind of the importance of IP and how you deal with that? Because now you're probably bringing in other folks from your firm, and it's just one of these things that's overwhelming a lot of times for an early stage company.
Yeah. Well, I mean, IP is sort of what everything is about in life sciences. At the end of the day, that's the asset that everybody builds companies around and that drives value. So it's really critical. And I think, having good IP counsel in very early on, considering any patent rights that a company might be taking out of a university is important, but also really think about how the company is going to build its own patent portfolio as it starts to develop and file its own patents. So getting somebody really good in early stage is really important. And a little plug for Cooley, we do it really well, but a lot of other people do as well. There's a lot of boutiques that are good at it. And you want someone who's really got a lot of life sciences patenting experience on board early. It's a big mistake not to have that, because it really just drives it ultimately, the decisions you make about IP in year one are the things that will drive your value in year 12 or so, when you are, looking for some kind of a nice exit or what have you.
Yeah, and I think one of the things that I'm really glad you said that. I think one of the things that a lot of early stage entrepreneurs don't understand is the way that their patent portfolio is going to grow, the areas that they can grow, and where those areas are going to be important. Because it's one thing to license IP out of the university. But even once you do that, you're never done, right? It's not one and done. Oh, and to go back to the licensing improvements on the technology, that's an area that I remember well from anything we've ever done with a platform, and making sure that, if you do things to actually improve the technology, that those sections are pretty clean.
Yep, for sure.
So here's David with his question.
Here's David. All right. Whew.
It says, how could VCs do better IP diligence, seek merits, folks in the network, folks who look like the other people like in the negotiations? And he said, what questions will help spot weaknesses? Yeah. So like, how do you think about that advice? Like IP counsel, like if you're looking for IP counsel,
Yeah.
how do you go about making sure you have the right counsel for what you're trying to do?
Yeah, I think it's important to really try to look for IP counsel who have experience working very closely in other sort of adjacent areas. A really good IP counselor, and that's not me, again, I'm a licensing person, but a really good hardcore patent attorney that is going to be useful to a company is going to understand investor diligence. They're going to have been through that a lot of times. They're going to understand underwriter diligence at an IPO stage. They're going to understand acquirer diligence, and they're going to advise from the start about, to look out for pitfalls and to build your portfolio in a way that anticipates the kind of questions that you're going to get. What you want to do, in my opinion, is stay away from patent counsel who are just going to be down totally in the weeds, helping you write a really good patent application, but they're not thinking about these other things. So really finding somebody experienced with a track record of working for quite a while in the industry and through a lot of financings is important, I think. So picking the right person is important. And then I particularly like IP counsel who go in and for diligence, especially early diligence, go in and really start just asking a whole bunch of really open-ended questions and sort of let whether it's the licensor or whoever is explaining their patent rights, let them just kind of explain it in a narrative way and listen before diving in with a lot of really pointed questions. And so I always kind of appreciate the folks who kind of let the licensor or the patent owner, tell their story before kind of picking it apart.
Because don't you think that also helps suss out, especially if it's an early entrepreneur or somebody that hasn't done this a lot, that also helps the IP attorney really figure out what the long-term goals are. They may not be able to articulate it in a way that's sort of in legalese, but then listening to that story helps the IP lawyer know what to do, right? And how to structure things.
Yeah, for sure.
Okay, so this is one that's probably on every entrepreneur's mind anytime that they think about legal counsel. And I'm going to preface this question with the fact that my belief is that the only thing more expensive than an expensive lawyer is a cheap lawyer. Okay, so how does an entrepreneur talk to legal counsel and IP counsel, et cetera? How do they talk about fees, right? How do they talk about either budgeting for fees? It's a big deal. I don't know that people talk about it terribly effectively, but what in your mind is the best way for an entrepreneur to get a handle on what that's going to look like? Because that impacts how they raise money. And there are a few things more terrifying than getting an invoice from your law firm when you're not sure how you're going to pay said invoice. So how does that work, and how do you guys handle the early discussion?
Yeah, so the early discussion, I think, really has to involve a discussion of staffing. That's really important because, everybody, like the thing that from a client perspective that everybody sees first is sort of an hourly rate, or, what are a particular firm's rates. And that's great. That helps to tell you a little bit about how expensive or inexpensive a particular firm might be. But more importantly, it's sort of how are they going to staff matters, because the way that legal bills often run up very, very quickly and high is if something's overstaffed, there's too many people or more people than need to be working on something. So I would approach it, and this is how I used to approach it when I was in-house at Merck, really talk about, who's going to do what. And then that puts the hourly rate in context, and it also lets you sort of then compare that to other proposals. And so, thinking about staffing is really important, and then also trying to break the work down into chunks or phases or projects and try to have a discussion about what each thing will cost. That's also, you know, tied to the staffing, but sort of like, here's an estimate or a range or a typical range for what it will cost to do A or B or C.
Yeah.
And sort of get those, you know, big picture costs. Again, the last thing and the way you lead to surprises is you just kind of like focus only on the hourly rate. You know what the rate is, and you
Right.
don't pay much attention to the overall costs. You can have two firms and they can have, you know, similar hourly rates and very, very dramatically different total cost.
Different cost. Yeah.
Yeah, you know, the line on the phone call, this shouldn't take you more than an hour, right? Okay, so I think that's really useful and important, because again, I think there's the advice you give entrepreneurs, which is work with someone good, and then very often you have to tell them what that entails, and also that, like, you know, listen, it's okay, because if you work with someone that isn't good, they're going to work twice as long and the product isn't going to be nearly as good, and you're going to pay the same amount, if not more, for worse work. And there's a heck of a lot more advantages to using good people than that. So why don't we talk about that a little bit? I think the way that, and maybe correct me if I'm wrong, maybe I just kind of looked at this a little bit more over the past 10 years, but I think legal counsel has become kind of almost much more of an intimate advisor to companies in and around network, whether it's financing, whether it's transactions, et cetera. So, you know, has it always been like that? Has it evolved to be more of that recently?
I think it's evolved. So my focus has always been the life sciences space. So, you know, that's the relevant one for all of us here. And it has evolved in that space. I think it's part of the overall, you know, very, very broad trend that goes back, you know, decades now, where, you know, in earlier days, some of the big pharma companies did so much research in-house themselves. You know, they've diversified over the years to feed their pipeline, their programs so much by working with smaller innovative companies. Well, along with that comes the fact that these smaller companies, you know, they never have the legal staff that a big company has. So some of them have no in-house attorneys, some have one, some have three, but they never have like the really specialized folks. And they also don't necessarily have specialized folks in all of the other adjacent roles. Like a big company, they'll have finance people, they will have public affairs people, they will have legal, they will have, you know, they'll have business development folks who are separate from the legal folks. But at a smaller company, you don't have sort of those luxuries. And so I think that legal counsel, especially ones who work a lot in the industry, can really add a lot of value by the fact that they have a lot of touches in all those areas, and they can be good advisors because they've been through and they've seen all of these issues playing out for so many of their other clients. And so I think hopefully it's a good value add for a lot of clients. If they work with a Cooley or another similar firm that's deep into life sciences, they can have somebody who they can ask not just strictly legal questions to, but they can talk to them about strategy, about if you're trying to raise money and you're trying to talk to investors. You know, a lot of this is not legal, a lot of this is strategy, and it's having been there, done that, and common sense and advice from somebody who's sort of been around the block. So I think there is a lot more of that in our industry, sort of as the really innovative work has scattered across way more smaller companies.
And people, I mean, and to be fair, people like you, right, who have been on both sides of the equation, representing clients, and then in-house, and are able to take that experience. I mean, it's not like when you walk away from one role, you just forget everything, right? I mean, that's part of the value that someone like you would bring. Rich Allen has a great multi-pronged question, and I think maybe a good place for it. It says he's curious about the type of legal issues in life science that have come up often more recently, say in the last 1 to 2 years, that have traditionally been under the radar. And he gives a couple of examples, right? Cybersecurity liability, business consolidation, increased or longer BD diligence discussions. Talk to us about the trends that you're seeing for your clients in some of those areas.
Yeah, sure. So I think, you know, it's always an evolving landscape, but the last 18 months or so have been particularly interesting as the climate has changed around financings and with the economy in general. And so you are seeing things like, you know, longer diligence cycles. I also am finding some really, you know, interesting diligence efforts or long cycles where some of the companies that are trying to in-license or partner with smaller companies in what are new areas for the bigger companies, don't have a lot of experience. So like AI for drug discovery. So, seeing how deeply and how long the big pharmas want to spend diligencing and trying to understand that, partly because I think they're learning it as they go when they're working with some of these smaller companies that are doing that kind of innovative work. So definitely it's been interesting. That there was an embedded question there about consolidations. I guess that's not, I don't know that that's really a new legal issue, but it's something that's on the landscape. It's something that's happening. A lot of companies are looking at combining in various ways as they kind of start to run low on cash, or they have to figure out what's their runway and how are they going to do this. If they can find another company that has, a complementary technology or otherwise is sort of complementary, there are a lot of discussions underway about sort of trying to roll up some smaller companies for efficiencies and other reasons. So we are seeing a lot of that. I don't know if that answered the.
Yeah. And what about the cybersecurity issues? I feel like I feel like I get once a week something, from some store that I've bought something from over the last year that says your password has been compromised. But clearly it's an entirely different realm if you're clinical and you're talking about patient data, right? I'm not talking about my Amex number, which Amex can issue me another one. We're talking about actual some very, very serious.
It's a very critical area. The whole data space has just sort of exploded between data being stored in the cloud now, and then you have very intense regimes related to patient privacy, et cetera, in Europe and elsewhere, and you have cybersecurity issues that come along with all of that. So really, having a good handle around the data issues is really critical. I work a lot with some colleagues at Cooley who specialize in that. That's their thing, as opposed to life sciences per se. But there's so much more blurring of the lines, and so many transactions that I work on now have that heavy data component, because they're going to be, the data will go off somewhere into the cloud, and it'll go across continents, and and someone has to be responsible for ensuring compliance with the laws, and also worrying about data or cybersecurity. So it's a big space, and I feel like it's an area where there is sort of a lot of blurring between various practice areas within law. There used to be people specializing only sort of in that, and then there were people doing life sciences transactions, and now we all work together. I feel like I'm on the phone with my colleagues several times a week on data issues.
Yeah.
Okay, so why don't we transition a little bit? Let's talk a little bit about kind of licensing and transactions, right? And let's kind of think about it from the early stage, kind of the seed Series A company, whether it's we can split it too. We can think about platform companies and asset companies. So after you raise either whatever your first 10 million is, I don't know whether that's a seed or a Series A these days, but you have $10 million. And what are the ways that you need to start to think about setting your company up for whatever potential transaction that you want to do, whether it's an out licensing of an asset, or we can even focus on kind of platform companies now.
Yeah, sure. So if a company is a platform company, or even a company that has just multiple programs, they may be all part of one platform and maybe separate, but you have multiple assets that you want to advance. There is a lot of room to do some interesting partnering deals that are very helpful, especially in today's environment, to bring in some non-dilutive financing, where somebody will come in, some company that's interested in what you're doing will come in, pay a nice big upfront amount to partner with you and work on R&D with you, and finding ways to do that in a way that helps you enable that kind of a deal and get that money in the door, but then leaves enough for your company to work on for its own purposes and for its own pipeline is really critical. So I think I always think about it as sort of how is a company going to kind of carve up its world, and think about splitting apart different indications or targets or things like that, so that it can give away some value in return for cash, but also keep enough. And it's not just all about giving away value. It's also by partnering with somebody, it often increases your bandwidth to actually pursue multiple shots on goal, right? This will let you work on more targets or more indications than you could by yourself. So a nice partnering deal is great, not just because it's not non-dilutive and you get some cash, and you might someday get royalties and milestones and things if it's successful, but it also it brings validation working with another company, but also it expands your shots on goal. It gives you more efforts that you can run in parallel. And so thinking through like, how are you going to carve that up in a way that's going to let you do more than one of those deals is really critical. So you have to think very hard about the boundaries of exclusivity that you might be giving to one partner, and what are you going to keep for yourself or keep to give to others. So very early, a platform company needs to start to develop a strategy of that type. It's a little bit different if there's a single asset type company.
Right. It needs to be, if you need to do more than one deal, if your business model is predicated on doing these deals, you need to either leave room to do more of them, or you need enough assets to do a bunch of those deals. But yeah, you can't have basically the first deal you do be the last deal that you do. Although the interesting question is how do you really get to the point where you're set up to do the deal that you want to do, right? Especially if you're an early stage platform company. You mentioned the word validation, which I think is really important. It's rare that the first deal you do as a platform company is the, $50 million upfront, 5 targets, $1 billion in bio bucks on each one. Like, it's very rare that that's the first deal out of the gate.
Yeah, I mean, the first partner is sometimes the hardest to land, right? Because they do bring the validation. After you've done that, it does help with others. So yeah, there's a little bit of that. I think learning to tell the company's story is critical. This is something where it's kind of fun to advise, not really from a legal standpoint, but more with experience working with investors to sort of look at decks and things that people are putting together to sort of tell their story and sort of dangle it out there and get interested parties. It's kind of fun. But telling that first story and doing it in a way that triggers interest from a first possible partner is a challenge.
Yeah.
More so than once you've done one.
Yeah. A plug for the fall. We don't have a date yet, but we're working on in partnership with Cooley, a mini pitch day, right, for early stage companies this fall to do some of that exact thing, right? To be able to help provide in a non-legal sense, right, feedback and thoughtful help from our ecosystem. Derek, you want to ask the?
Yeah, we could do that. I like this one. So while we're talking about partnerships, can we talk a little bit about kind of some of the challenges of, let's say, international rights, and maybe specifically either Japan or China, Asia, et cetera. So I think the US and EU are reasonably known markets, but I think probably the discussions around the Asian markets have probably changed a lot in the last little bit.
Yeah. So there has been, for the last bunch of years, there have been a lot of deals with Chinese companies licensing the greater China rights for programs from US companies. And it's been a great thing for US biotech or med device or pharma companies, because they can get money from Chinese investors sometimes easier, I feel, than from others, and they can give away some rights that they probably were never going to be able to pursue themselves anyway. Now, sometimes they have to be careful, because a big partner might want to come in and get worldwide rights someday. So that's a whole discussion, and sometimes you have to think about whether you get a buyback right or something to sort of maybe take those rights back if you need them. But those deals have been very attractive for a long time. I think there are challenges that come with that, and I think there's sort of a fraught political environment these days that has made people maybe a little bit more cautious even about doing some of those deals. Considerations around maybe where is a product going to be manufactured, who's going to manufacture it, are you going to tech transfer sort of the secret sauce for manufacturing, if that's a thing for a given product? Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. Will you be required to? For some products that's really critical. For others, they're pretty easy to manufacture, and that's not really an issue. How do you deal with data issues? Can you actually make use outside of China of some of the data that a Chinese partner generates in China, and vice versa? Mm-hmm. How do you assign sort of final decision rights over things when somebody is running programs in China, and you might want to make sure that they are not doing things that might generate unhelpful data for your program elsewhere, et cetera? So sort of all of those things are very, very important. And I think there's more focus on those, and there's more tension in the negotiation of those than there are sometimes when you're doing a US deal or a European deal, for sure.
Well, and just look at the news yesterday. I think I saw, didn't I say that AZ is thinking about spinning out a separate Chinese entity and listing it in Hong Kong? And that's obviously a very large multinational corporation that has the ability to do something like that and can, in order to continue doing the business they want to do in China. But we're talking about companies that don't have that option, right?
Yeah, yeah, sure. And there are, tax and other issues that really have to be looked at hard in terms of how the money flow for some of these deals works. And there's always, concern that there may be, changes to tax law that impose additional taxes, maybe on funds coming out of China that maybe beyond what the taxes might look like today. And so how do you account for that? And how do you make sure you protect against, the future when the future is so uncertain?
That's why you need good lobbyists.
So what about when you're thinking about transactions, what about corporate participation in equity rounds? And is this something that tends to, how does this even come about in conversation, right? Would it be a thing where you're using the actual partnering event to kind of stimulate an equity round? Do you have to have the equity round together, and you have to have the partnering conversation going on in parallel? Like, how do the mechanics of that work? Because you kind of have to have kind of two separate transactions that you're almost either mashing into one, or it's at a separate equity transaction. How do people go about that? Because I feel like corporate folks have been much more active on the equity front, really ever since, Celgene started doing it in the early, 2010s. And then it was really in vogue for a while. And now every, large biopharma basically has its own, if not independently operating, but, certainly very active venture fund in the community.
Yeah, well, I think, I see those investments originating sort of two separate ways. There's sometimes it's one of the big pharma's venture funds out there looking for exciting new companies, really the way any other venture fund might, and they sort of approach just like a venture fund, right? And so that could be sort of just a standalone investment. Where it gets a little bit more interesting is sometimes when the deal, so to speak, the investment deal is really driven by the BD deal. It's really the company is looking to do an R&D arrangement with a company, and then they want to make an investment. And often I see that often coming about in part where the smaller innovative company is pushing for a very large upfront payment of cash. Yeah. And often the pharma partner or the large biotech partner might say, well, we don't want to give you that much all in cash. We'll do part of it in equity, right? Yeah. So that, and understandably, that makes sense to them, and it makes sense, for everybody. But so often then you have the timing questions, Derek, that you're talking about. Like, if that's happening, does the timing line up with the next round so that it's easy to just sort of slot them in as one participant, or is this a one-off in between rounds? And if so, how are you going to deal with pricing and everything else?
If you raised if you raised $50 million in a Series A or a Series B 8 months ago, 9 months ago, a year ago, right? And you have this BD deal, which is great, right? You probably aren't thrilled about having that equity convert at the previous price. So now you have to value that equity above your previous round, right? And in theory, I guess you could go to others around the community, use it a bit as a catalyst, and it's almost kind of like, hey, we're doing this BD deal, here's the term sheet, right? It's kind of not exactly like you're going and telling your story in the community. It's like, oh, remember us from a year ago? Well, we've got a new term sheet for you if you'd like to play. By the way, you have a week,
Yeah, I mean, you could use it to jumpstart a quick round. It is the catalyst for a round, or maybe, sometimes you could have it be really a commitment to participate in the next round, which may put that off in time a little ways, but you have that commitment, and then it takes care of valuation and things itself if they wait and participate in the next round. Mm-hmm. Some other really just interesting discussions that come along with those kinds of investments relate to board seats and board observer rights and things like that, because often the investor company in that context, they want to sort of dip their toe in, get to know the company better, kind of hang around the hoop in case that company becomes an acquisition target for them at some point. But there's a little tension there because the company doesn't want to get one investor too entrenched, if it's going to limit other options, et cetera. So negotiations around some of those features, are very important in the context of an equity investment by a strategic.
And does it vary as to what the best outcome for the early stage company is based on the portfolio, which strategic we're talking about? I mean, like, is there a standard, this is a good outcome, or is it really, it depends?
I think it's sort of it depends, right? It's sort of who is the strategic, how much of a fit might they be? Are they bringing any value to the table as far as contributions they might make in terms of advice if they know the space really well? Also, frankly, how much money are they paying? It, at the end of the day, it's all part of a big discussion. So sometimes, what might be a good outcome might be different from one scenario to the next.
Yeah. How often do you see that? Like an earlier stage company does a partnership or an investment deal with a strategic, and that actually kind of scares off other potential strategic partners?
I think it happens more than we might think. I think, you don't always see it, right? Because you don't know about the deals that don't happen sometimes, right? So I think, but when you're diligencing companies to look at them as acquisition targets, you're taking a very deep dive into any collaboration type arrangements or license arrangements that they have. And sometimes if those seem onerous, or they seem like too much, or they don't leave enough room to maneuver because too much exclusivity has been given away to other partners or something, that can kill deals at the diligence stage, and then you don't really see that those are killed. That nobody knows that they were under consideration, maybe. So it does happen, but we also see the opposite quite a bit, where the validation of having one big player on board really helps others get interested, and you get sort of like the little gold rush of everybody wants to play with a particularly hot and exciting company. So that can be great news. And then we do see a lot of times that when there is an acquisition of a smaller company, it turns out that the bigger company had some kind of a collaboration or deal with them somewhere along the way. So they did use it to dip the toe in and get to know the company.
Yeah.
So kind of going up to a little more 30,000 foot here, that we've talked about individual company stuff, and I think everyone is looking at the financing environment and wondering when that kind of stuff is going to get better. So what do you see really in the marketplace now about getting deals done? And anecdotally, it sounds like it's very hard for folks to raise money at just about any stage at the moment. So where do you think things are now, and if things are bad, when do you think things might get better?
Yeah, I think we're slowly starting to see some improvement, and I think my hope, not knock on wood, I don't have any wood, one knock on my plastic computer, is that we are probably more than halfway through this downturn. So I'm sort of thinking maybe around the end of the year or the first half of next year, things are going to improve. I don't know that they're going to go back to sort of gangbusters like they were, but I think they're going to really turn a corner. And I think one thing I've seen is an increasing number of life sciences companies getting out there with follow-on offerings, and so that's starting to pick up. Not really, much pickup on the IPO side yet, but on the follow-on side. And I think it takes time for the market to sort of digest what rates look like today. They seemed extraordinarily high very quickly compared to what they were, but historically they're not that high. And sooner or later, people have to do deals, they have to raise money, they have to make investments, and they have to do these things. And so I think there slowly is coming a time where like people get on with life, which includes, investing money. And so it's starting to turn slowly, but I'm hopeful that we're more than halfway through the worst of it.
Yeah. Does it seem like something where, the summer is going to do what the summer does? August is going to be kind of sleepy, and then people might wake up in September and realize that they should probably try and get some deals done before the end of the year?
Yeah, I hope so. So.
It'll make JP Morgan more exciting anyway, if there's a big rush at the end of the year. So,
yep.
So I'm an earlier stage company, right? And I recognize that what I've raised so far is not runway to get me maybe to the end of sort of this period of slowdown period. What should I be thinking about as far as positioning my company to not only, right, sort of survive, but also to be able to hopefully thrive and be positioned that, let's say, I want to, I'm looking at the public markets, and in the future. What is my thought process?
Yeah. So I think one of the things that you should be looking at is whether there's room for you to find some kind of a company that's interested in doing a partnering deal with you. Now, how much money you can bring in the short term is very dependent on the technology and a number of other factors. But you see deals all the time where you could bring in anywhere from 5 million to a couple $100 million in an upfront to work with a company. And again, if you can sort of carve up your world in a way where you're not giving away too much and you're not sort of giving away the crown jewels or leaving the company sort of crippled because you've done that, those kind of deals are very, very attractive. So I would be trying to get out there and try to find somebody who likes your technology, wants to try it out in some space or another, a particular indication or particular target or particular application, and see if they want to partner with you. That's one thing. I think the other thing that companies are having to do a lot is just sort of right size and really just focus on what matters. And we're seeing just a lot of companies have to sort of park certain programs and sort of deploy their resources in more targeted ways. That's just kind of the reality. So we are seeing a lot of companies sort of pare things back. Sometimes they have to be careful to not be parking things that are subject to a license, and they can see the license be terminated if not making efforts. So they might have to go back to a university or a licensor and have a discussion and sort of get some leeway and sort of maybe renegotiate some diligence milestones or something to give themselves some more breathing room. And I found that a lot of the tech transfer offices are being relatively reasonable right now. They understand the environment and they're giving a little bit of leeway within reason to companies who are having some challenges. So that's another thing that you could do, is try to look at where you can sort of temporarily shelve some efforts to sort of pare back your spend.
So in that scenario, the IP would automatically revert to the university if, in this case, if the company weren't making a sufficient progress according to what the license agreement said, right?
Yeah. So sometimes it's a very hard and fast thing. Sometimes it's a looser standard as far as what counts as reasonable efforts or not. But a lot of agreements have hard and fast diligence milestones where you have to reach a certain stage of development by a certain date. Mm-hmm. And often you can negotiate an extension of those, or reasonable extension, if you have a very good explanation. And so sometimes just working to get a little more breathing room lets you sort of take the foot off the gas pedal spend wise a little bit on some efforts, just to try to get through the next 6 months or a year.
Right. And everyone's in the same bucket too, right? I mean, in a financing scenario like this. So yeah.
So here's a that's semi-tough one. Over the last few years, we've had these large Series A rounds with kind of the I don't know, the go whatever numbers those were, right? And we funded a lot of platform companies. And now when times are tough, how do platform companies basically make it so that they are valued for their platform's potential and not just kind of their most advanced asset, right? How do they go into what are probably going to be really difficult fundraising discussions, especially if there were companies that raised a big round and grew? And how do you actually get valued for the thing that you want your company to be valued at, and not kind of what investors like to do sometimes, which is look at the lead asset and say, well, this is what we think of your lead asset, and there goes your company.
Yeah. So again, I think maybe one of the answers is partnering transactions. That's what I do. So I always come back to that. But I think if you're a platform company and you can partner some of your platform with a variety or with several different players, it really shows validation to investors too, because it's showing that the platform is going to advance. It's going to be a true platform. It's going to lead to multiple products that will be hitting the market, maybe by different companies, different partner companies. But it's hard to sort of, if you have one lead asset and then you have a bunch of the rest of the platform and it's all just internal and you have it for yourself and you haven't really gotten that validation, it is hard to maybe ascribe as much value to some of that. But once you've partnered it, I think that investors see that that's much more, that some of those platform technologies are more on a path to eventual commercialization, because that's really what they want to see. They need to be able to see revenue someday on the reasonable horizon.
Yep.
Um,
Yep.
and
And importantly, I think the foresight piece is you have to realize when you're going to be out in the market again, and you have to basically hit the partnering market pretty hard so that you have these things to show. You can't just kind of go to investors and say, well, we're going to actually partner some more. That's not gonna help you all that much.
Yeah. You're gonna have to have like term sheets at least, or something to show that there's real interest.
You need to have a few chess moves ahead on the board while you're actually, you need to know ahead of time the situation you're going to be when you're going to be fundraising, and kind of plan the story accordingly. And you mentioned it before, like how you tell your story is so important.
we had a question earlier from John Pennant, sort of as we were moving out of the sort of the university discussion. I want to make sure I get that in though. It says, are there rules of thumb that can be used by entrepreneurs of university spinouts when negotiating their license terms? Anything sort of big picture that every single entrepreneur should be sort of thinking about?
Well, I'll circle back to what Derek brought up, which was this effort to create sort of a model type of a term sheet. It's out there. It can be had from some of the venture firms have it. We have it. People can show this, and looking at that sort of lays out, what are the common features of sort of a market type license. And so familiarizing oneself with that is super helpful in advance of actually engaging with any particular university. I think, the thing I always think about with university licenses when I'm trying to negotiate to take technology out of university is trying to keep in mind that, this really does have to be a win-win for everybody. You can't just kind of go in and try to strike some deal that leaves the university with an unreasonably modest outcome. They have needs, and you really have to be respectful and listen to that. And I think I like to approach sort of all the partnering discussions, whether it's those or others, really trying to have a very good channel of communication to talk about each party's actual must-haves. Let's understand what we each need, and let's respect that and find a path forward that gets each party what they actually must have. And then there's a lot of nice to haves that we can trade back and forth on, and we can do, go back and forth on. But I think, really understanding that, although we all want to get a license from a university on extremely favorable terms, it's still got to be a market deal and a fair deal, and sort of being mindful of that, goes a long way. Just the tone that one takes when approaching a university.
Especially like you alluded to before, you might have to go back. You might have to go back and renegotiate or anything like that. And goodwill counts, right? If you're terrible during the negotiations and you stick it to them at every corner possible, they just might not be so favorable if you need to go back and say relax some of those terms in the future.
Yeah.
How you approach negotiations in pretty much every area of business or life can actually be beneficial to you later, or it can come back to haunt you. We only have a few minutes left, so I don't. This is a New York Bio discussion, so and you also, Alan. I didn't disclose this earlier. Maybe I should have. Alan does sit on the board of New York Bio, but I think we should talk a little bit about the sort of the New York ecosystem and how you've seen the growth and development and change in the New York ecosystem over the last, 5 to 7 years.
Yeah, I think the ecosystem has been growing wonderfully, and I think New York Bio has played a big role in that. I think, New York has all the right pieces, we all know, to sort of be an absolute top player in the space. But part of what I think New York is still playing a little bit of catch up on relative to maybe the Bay Area or Boston is sort of building that ecosystem and building those relationships, because I do think it's really key. Those relationships among the different stakeholders in an ecosystem are essential. So, you have the universities who are spinning out great technology. You need to have those people know the founders who may or may not come from those universities, but they have to know seed investors and venture funds really well. and have a level of trust and a level of sort of repeat engagement so that you can get those technologies spun out. And then you need to also have the ability to look at the later parts of the life cycle for companies and have relationships with the folks who are going to be the underwriters for public offerings, or the bigger companies who are going to be possible acquirers. Now, one really nice thing in the New York area, the New York area more broadly, including New Jersey, et cetera, is we have a lot of big companies here. A lot of those companies end up being the companies that, you know, may provide a nice exit someday. And so building those relationships are really critical as well. So I see a lot of progress. I feel like 5 to 7 years ago, Jennifer, there was almost no organized ecosystem, or there wasn't much there, and now there's a lot, largely due to New York Bio. And I think we just are going to have to keep, you know, building it. And I see, you know, great days ahead.
Thanks. Yeah, and I think one other, you know, one piece, when it was funny, so I started at New York Bio 5 years ago, and one thing that we're still hearing is there's not space. Well, I think we both have, and we have coming online, right? A lot more space in which life sciences companies can operate in and around the city, right? And New York, I look at the region too when we're talking about, you know, sort of this part. And then another thing I've heard is that we're still lacking, and I think this is probably a valid concern, in sort of the serial entrepreneur, right? Like you were talking about, the one that will go back to the university and do it again, right? That the serial founder, if you will. I don't think we've had that as many exits as we need to generate that sort of C-suite talent that's sort of this flywheel. Do you see that changing over time?
I think it may. On that last piece, I think that's tricky, because I think some of the places where that has worked really well, so Boston or the Bay Area, it's surprising how small of a handful of individuals we're talking about, you know, who have spun off so many companies. So it's really 3, 4, 5, 6 people account for a lot of that, and finding or developing or having somebody do that in New York is, you know, it's a challenge. Somebody will, and that's going to be important to see it happen, but it's not that easy. I think on the other pieces of it, the space piece is critical, but I think things have changed. Frankly, the pandemic helped with real estate prices in that regard quite a bit. And also just the amount of investment, the amount of lab space has increased tremendously. And so I think all the right infrastructure is being put in place. And that was something that New York didn't used to have. But now I think New York will be competitive in that regard.
Yeah, and you know, and one thing that we also didn't have in the past, well, we kind of half had, that both the state of New York and the city of New York in their economic development, you know, efforts were almost sort of both kind of doing their own thing, but now they're working more closely together. Different administrations work differently together, right? And we've seen that the state in their budget this year passed some matching funds, right, for SBIR grants, and there's some tax incentives that were reinstated in the city for life science companies. So we're starting to also see coming together of sort of these, I'll call them, you know, government structural incentives, right, to do business in the state and New York City. So I think that's been helpful. We literally have 2 minutes left. So what do you see as, Alan, what do you see as sort of your and Cooley's contribution to the life science ecosystem over the next couple of years?
Well, I think one thing that is, if not unique, it's special about Cooley is just that we work with so many of these different stakeholders in the life sciences space. We have a really long-standing practice in life sciences, but we work with, you know, founders. Historically, Cooley's a firm, you know, coming out of Silicon Valley originally, that works a lot with tech companies from day one. So we work with founders all the way up through capital markets practice. And so we sort of touch all the different stages for companies. And so I think that positions us nicely to help with some of this sort of building of the ecosystem, because we do have contacts in all the relevant groups. And so for things like the showcase events, the mini pitch day and things like that, you know, anything we can do to, you know, help with those efforts and sort of maybe bring in some contacts that we have to come attend those events, we're happy to do. We sort of feel like, you know, part of our mission as a firm is to see New York grow as a life sciences market, and that really aligns so closely with NewYorkBIOs goals. So, you know, we're always excited and happy to partner in whatever way we can.
Good, thank you. Thanks for joining us today. I thought this was very helpful, and I know the audience thought so too, because we had tons of questions. So thanks for your time. I hope everybody has a good Tuesday.
All right. Thanks so much,
Thanks for
Alan.
having
Have
me.
a great day, everybody.
Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.